because it is in our story where we truly find that in our DNA, that same DNA that flowed through our ancestors is here today. And that trail of tears, that forced removal, is where we find that resilience so many times.
And so as you think about your journey, about where you have been personally, not only your ancestors, not only your great-grandparents, but where you have been. And we are in the midst of a revitalization right now that is so exciting. The Trail of Tears has some very meaningful stories, but each one of you has stories.
We must amplify our historical perspective and not allow a modern removal. Sovereignty and self-determination are too valuable for future generations. However, this will require not only the strength of our tribal leaders, it will require the strength of our people.
And we know the battles and we know the scars that our ancestors felt because we feel those. And when we peel these layers back, we can find that healing. And our country, our tribes are undergoing a time of healing continuously. But today, we understand that there's so much that is out there for each of us to grasp and to take hold. And it is organizations like this that are going to be paramount to what our youth see tomorrow, so that they can have a future and pass these stories and these things along in the most relevant and the most righteous way each and every day.
We wouldn't be gathering here knowing that we've got a great Cherokee democracy. We wouldn't be here, and I couldn't be here as a chief of a nation, because our nation might not exist. But it does exist. The Cherokee people are still here. We're stronger than ever, and part of our strength is we've got great friends in the National Trail of Tears Association. Thank you all very much for your friendship and your work.
Thank you, Jack, and thank you for putting a small device on here that will shock me when I get to the 1.5 hour mark. Oh my goodness. I'm going to arrange a few things while I'm up here, just for the fun of it. And I think I'm going to hold this microphone. Can everyone hear me okay? Can you hear me all right? My grandfather would be upset with me if I did not say, Osio Nagada. But David Hampton would be upset if I didn't say, Ka Guhusti Adadadani. If I didn't say, hey, cousins. And let's see the hands of those of you who have descended from the Stills, the Benjes, the Adairs, and the Stars. Let's just see those hands. Okay, keep those up. I'm going to want to know where you are, because I'll need to borrow gas money before I get out of here today. And that's what we cousins do, indeed. Yeah, my name is Jay Hanna. Now, Hannah's a good Scottish name, much like Adair, much like Ward, much like Ross, much like many of the intermarried Scots among the Cherokees. But I was told by Luella Kuhn from East Peavine, she said, you know, Jay, down in our part of the country, we say Hannah by honey, and they sort of do their hand this way. I don't know why. She meant we want to chop off while you're talking, or what she said. Didagonti Adair County, Didagonti Adair County. I am from Adair County. And it is my honor to be here today. There is a comfort in coming home. And while the curvature of time changes both the landscape as well as the faces of neighbors and maybe a few cousins, the poet reminds us that though much is taken, much abides. And so from this very geographic point where you have assembled here today, where we've assembled, one can explore the physical memory of place. This cusp of the Ozark Plateau was more than just an entry point for the old settlers tossed into Lovely's Purchase back in 1828. 10 years later, it would be the portal for the newly minted Cherokee Nation, as outlined in the Treaty of New Echota on that December night in 1835. I love the fact that the gravity of place has meaning for us, past, present, and indeed in the future as well. But a clear understanding of the past does not guarantee a clear view of the future. However, there are clues. As is written in the Scripture, we see beyond the glass darkly. The mortal coil of chronology is limited to living within our prescribed time allocation. And while we are too often deluded in our ideas of what is to come as being clear and crisp in our thinking, the actuality is that we are granted a less illuminated understanding of what will be. Maybe that's why this organization exists. Maybe that's the very reason that so many of you have traveled from so far away to be a part of this Trail of Tears Association conference. Perhaps we are all in search of closure. Perhaps we're all in search of a deeper meaning of who we were before and after the Trail of Tears. Maybe, just maybe, we strain to hear distant echoes to prevent future incursions, societal and political. It's in these trespasses that, if left unattended, might corrode away the Creator's designed purpose for us as a nation, as clans, as communities, as families, and more so as individuals. Many have come home just as surely as the the geese have made their southerly flight to evade the cold, the northern winter. You know, I read once that ornithologists believe that geese have an internal clock in their brain that measures how much sunlight there is each day of the season. And as the days grow shorter, during late summer or in early fall, that clock has an alarm that says it is time for it's time for us to go. Families join to make larger flocks. Our families, whether they were Cherokees, whether they were Muskogee, whether they were Creek, Chickasaws, Choctaws, Seminoles, those and tribes unnamed, you see, they gathered together to make larger flocks. And they made their journey as well. Families joined to make flocks. I believe that culturally, we too have an internal clock. A great Cherokee culturalist, Benny Smith, a descendant of Redbird Smith, who led the Katua movement at the time of the allotment. He taught me that in ancient times, Cherokees would come together in the fall. It was a season after the harvest of crops and a time to take into account the past seasons in preparation for a new one. I believe it was a time of gratitude to Uneladanhi, to the Creator, His blessings, and a time, most importantly, of accountability. A time to prepare for changes caused perhaps by happenstance or maybe by design. It was a time to prepare and make ready for the seasons ahead. And Benny taught me, that these times we would be reminded of our purpose. The phrase was kaleho anehan. Kaleho anehan. It means as a whole they live. As a whole they live. I believe still this is the Creator's designed purpose for us, to live as a whole. I was born 2 miles from here. Yeah, just 2 miles. Now it's over to the east. It was a hot July day in 1955, and my granny looked at my mom, and my mother's name was Bobby. She said, "Bobby, we can't birth that baby here at the house. We're thrashing oats. And I've had to cook all day. You're going to have to go into town." My sister and I were the first of our family to be born in a hospital, and I came into the world in a delivery room at Siloam Springs Memorial Hospital, just 2 miles from here, which was built on the old Chautauqua grounds, Jack Baker, the Chautauqua grounds. My sister will tell you that that's why I like telling stories. While my mother's people were decidedly Arkansanians, my father's parents were both born citizens of the Cherokee Nation prior to statehood in the nation's old Flint district. I was raised on the Ward Indian Allotment Farm 4 miles from where we are seated right now, just to the west of here. An area known as Mosley's Prairie. Now that's with a possessive S, not a plural. Named for John Mosley, who was an intermarried white among the old settlers, and we are told he had a penchant for stealing horses. And therefore he was driven from the prairie, and all I can say is, isn't it odd how names stick? From where you are seated, we could drive 6 miles to the south to what is now the town of Watts, and we would find the original site of Fort Wayne, established in 1838 by Colonel R.B. Mason of the 1st Dragoons. He had a fellow traveling with him by the name of Boone, Nathan Boone, son of Daniel. Yes, they established that fort because these Arkansonians, just a few hundred yards from here, said, with all these Indians coming, we're going to need protection. There at the confluence of Ballard Creek and the Illinois River, the conditions were so untenable that the fort had to be relocated 20 miles north of here to Beatty's Prairie. Cherokee troops under my uncle Stand Watie, I will spare you of the greats today, the great part. But my uncle Stand Watie, they would occupy that abandoned military post. I think it was abandoned about 1842. But those that were Cherokees who took up the sword against the North assembled there at that abandoned fort. And yes, Beatty's Prairie, a place that you know because it too was one of the terminus sites and depots at the trail's end. You know, if you drove just a few miles north of that site, and depending upon your Cherokee lineage, you could either pay homage to or dispense scorn at the grave of Stand Watie, Major Ridge, and his son John Ridge, who sleep at Folsom Cemetery, within spitting distance of the boundaries and the borders between the Cherokee Nation, Missouri, and Arkansas. Those treaty party folk, they settled along the border to afford a quick and oftentimes a necessary escape if needed. And even today, I have no doubt that Stand Watie in his grave is posed for a quick getaway if there were in fact be Ross Party reprisals. From here, you can drive 10 miles south in that direction to Bushy Head Mountain and look out across lush green fields that are relatively unchanged from the spring of 1839 when it served as the terminus to the Trail of Tears and served as a supply depot for Cherokees to collect the new Echota Treaty's promised provisions. You know, those provisions that was going to sustain them for a full year while they were here in their new lands. You can view those fields from the eastern slope of Bushy Head Mountain, named for Reverend Bushy Head, who rests along with Evan Jones in the cemetery across from the Baptist church that is said to have a bell in its steeple that was carried over the Trail of Tears. And if we could get in our way back machines, back to the 1850s and stand there where the Baptist Mission Church is today, you would stand in awe of the largest brick building in the Cherokee Nation, the Baptist Mission, unfortunately burned during the American Civil War. Now, just north of Bushy Head Mountain, you could cross the Kansas City Southern Railroad tracks, cross just not too far from the Chewy Road, Jack Baker, and you'd cross into the Arkansas line and visit the grave of Elder and Cherokee headman Going Snake. Ooh, Katana, yes. He would be upset to know that he's resting in Arkansas. But back then, the boundary was not very clearly delineated. On the other hand, you could drive 3 miles to the west of here and see the grave of Ezekiel Proctor, or stand at the grave of the Proctor family patriarch William Proctor. It says right on his headstone, born 1796. He lived among the Cherokee. Just another 3 miles to the west would take you to the Beck-Hildebrand mill site, where Zeke's legal problems were manifested after the shooting of Aunt Polly Beck, a.k.a. Kesterson. Or maybe you might want to drive south and west of Westville to Christie to visit the site of Zeke's trial turned massacre at the Going Snake Courthouse in April of 1872. The repercussions of that disastrous event for U.S. Marshals, for the Beck family, and proctors alike, would usher in the beginning of federal jurisdiction into the Cherokee Nation. Further to the south, you'll find Stillwell. You can come to yet another trail terminus now within the limits of the city cemetery. Or turn to the east and cross into Arkansas and walk to the exact spot where Major Ridge was murdered from ambush near Dutch Mills in a Ross Party retaliation for his signature on the Treaty of New Echota. You see, ladies and gentlemen, from here where you are today, one can walk and see and touch the aftermath of the Trail of Tears and all that was manifested against the Cherokee people that were positioned here at that time. My grandfather told me of these places and their importance in our tribal history. He would say, Idanon, you come with me. You come, and he would say, boy, you come, Idanon, you come and see. You come and see these things. My boyhood was spent going to see things for myself. Moreover, in each visit to these places, I discovered the stories of my culture, often a dark history, and yet a story of tribal resilience. Even here in this conference center, we sit only yards from where I joined with Principal Chief Wilma Mankiller in the early 1990s to officiate the ribbon cutting for the bingo outpost. Oh, Wilma told me, she said, Jay, I hate taking us into gambling. She said, I find it repugnant. And then she turned and said, but I find it necessary. She said, we will need to find the most honest people that we can to run these businesses. One of the 3 original sites of bingo outposts that we had in the nation, it led us into the gaming enterprise. And today, Chief, it represents Utanadela, big money for us. Money that will help us in our self-determination. And money, as I will share with you later, has become a point of jealousy for many. Because today, if you'll stick with me, will you stick with me? Will you stick with me today? Will you stick with me? You come with me. And we are going to talk today about what this history means in the past, but we're going to talk about what it means in the future as well. It's amazing that years later, as chairman of the board of Cherokee Nation Businesses, that I would return here to this site, where I'd been with Wilma Mankiller on a very hot day. There was only one small tree that we gathered under. It was more of a bush than anything. And I told Wilma, I said, if we don't get out of here, we're going to die from exposure. We cut that ribbon. But I would return here as chairman of the board of Cherokee Nation Businesses when we opened this casino, hotel, and conference center. Now, as a boy, my dad and I, we attended the incorporation meeting of West Siloam Springs, Oklahoma. It was about where we're seated right now. They pulled up a trailer, and 5 guys got up, and they announced that they had had an election in 1969, and 35 of the 46 voters had decided that this would be an incorporated city. If someone had pulled me aside and said, by the way, young man, one day you will have a part in deciding the economic future of this community, I would have laughed. But it is amazing what you can do with $100 million. You see, time waits for no one. It waits for no one. And as noted, our view of the future is seldom the vision that we hold in our brightest dreams or in our darkest nightmares. History supports the fact that the future is proofed by words and by deeds. Now, personally, I would tell you I am beholden to this organization. The Trail of Tears Association has helped to shape my understanding and my views of the Trail of Tears and what it meant to my Cherokee families, and more so what it means to me as I share observations and conjectures with the younger members of my family, my tribal community, and for those who seek a clearer understanding of the removal. You were very kind to invite me to keynote your conference in 2009 in Gunnersville, Alabama, where my grandfather, John Benge, led the Cherokee detachment out of Fort Payne, Alabama in October 11th of 1838, across the Tennessee River there at Gunner's Ferry, on his way west with several hundred souls bound for the new country. In October of 2012, you invited me to speak at your conference in the Chickasaw Nation across the river from where I live today in Norman, Oklahoma, where I did a total deconstruct of the Treaty of New Echota by article and section so that we could see what it was that we agreed to. We could see things that are still being debated today, Chief, because there is that article that says we will grant to you a non-voting member of Congress. Yes. Yes. Now, I'm going to do a little history lesson, though, for my chief here for a moment, because if you really want to pin their ears back, you'll go back to the Treaty of Hopewell, 1785. You see, we were given the same provision there. Yeah. Once again, I don't know if that means 2 members in Congress, but you might think about it. And it certainly cannot be touted as simply being a treaty token. No. Our alliance with the United States at that time was one that was a fair exchange of sovereigns recognizing sovereigns. After all, that treaty, my uncle James Starr and grandfather John Bell, they were there to sign that document that spawned the removal's scarring of our people, ultimately leading to the death of James. And yes, I can take you to where he was assassinated. We know the place, and we stay away from it. Grandpa Bell and 300 other Cherokee families were expelled from the Cherokee Nation. They lived in exile in Mount Tabor, Texas, moved there during the 1840s, did not come home until after the war. You've afforded me time to address your annual conference at Cape Girardeau, Missouri in 2015. There I walked at Moccasin Springs. Many of you have as well. I said a prayer at a roadside grave of Otaki, Bushy Head, and I looked upon the same town square in Jackson, Missouri that my grandfather, George Still, Stidenon, he still stands. Stidenon, assistant detachment leader under Most Daniel. There, they walked the same path, the same square that was described in articles published by the Jackson Advertiser newspaper reporting about thousands of Cherokees who had passed through the town. I parked my car and walked the still visible trail at Bollinger Mill. And from there, I drove across the state of Missouri on a route covering in 15 minutes what our ancestors took an entire day to travel. You see, time waits for no one. Each of my talks, they pale in comparison to those of you who have been contributors to the greater literature of this organization. And yes, I have evoked reasoning, rationale, and perhaps even a few reverberations from the past. However, the true scholars that have conjured the details and helped to foster understanding, well, they're seated here in this room. Each one of you, no matter where you're from, the role that you play, whether it is professional or avocational or vernacular, your knowledge is a contribution to this social fire that we have built. Because I am a product of both Treaty Party and Ross Party, I've always said, well, first of all, apparently lust will overcome politics. Every time. How those benches and those stars got together is beyond me. They were shooting at one another during the Civil War, and thank God they were bad shots or I wouldn't be here. I've always said, secondly, though, and I mean this, is that I have no need to defend nor to denigrate my Cherokee ancestors' decisions regarding the removal. After all, their times were their time. It's for us to look at today. knowing that time waits for no one. It's our time to look across to seek understanding. Today, we cannot be deluded in our learned analysis of those troubled years just because we are imbued with 2020 hindsight. There is apparently more for us to learn from an examination of the Trail of Tears. So, what's my message today? Here on my native Mosley's Prairie, where my existence was placed, what insights am I even capable of offering to you? And as I have often been known for, what challenges might I inflict you with before you depart this conference? Yes, there is a central theme for me today, and oddly enough, it's not from the lips of my Cherokee grandfather or even my Jalagi Alisi, not my grandmother. It's they were grandparents that steeped me in language and culture and history and heritage. Rather, my theme today comes from my Watts High School English teacher, Nyla Phipps. She was from Westville. And yes, just 6 miles down the road, there I went to school in a single building where all 12 grades were in the same building. You came in the east end, and hopefully 12 years later, you would come out on the west end. And since I was raised north of the river in Mosley's Prairie, I was the first one on and the last one off the school bus for 12 years in a row. I graduated and became a Teamster member immediately after that. But it was in Nyla Phipps' English class that we read Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. And there is found my keynote for today. Will you stick with me? No, come with me. What is past is prologue. What is past is prologue. The title words spoken by Shakespeare's Antonio in The Tempest may well convey, I believe, a double meaning. Now, the sanguine interpretation is that everything that has taken place in the past is preparation for opportunities to come. Some would say that's what's already happened merely sets the stage for the really important stuff that will lead to greatness. I believe, though, in this date and time here in the state of Oklahoma, and I know many of you are not from here, but no, come with me. Let's sit here together in this place. I believe there's also a warning in Shakespearean phrase. That's what past is prologue. I was taught that history sets the context for the present, and without an elevated position to observe the beyond, our eye is yet unfocused on what awaits us as individuals and as sovereign nations. Dr. Martin Luther King's paraphrasing of the 19th century clergyman Theodore Parker, who actually coined the phrase that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I believe it is immutable truth is the force that bends that moral arc. And we should be in search of that truth here and now. Thus the reason I wish to look across the curvature of time and connect dots today. It may be that I've misaligned the actions of the past with the challenges of the present, but then again, maybe just then again. This organization, and those of you who are perennial attendees are students of the removal. You are the knowledge keepers, the scholars, both, as I mentioned, professional and vernacular, who have provided an understanding for those of us who are too often we grew up without a foundational awareness of which detachments our families were part of, which routes that they took, or in some cases, where their journey began or what they left behind. We know in abstract the hardships of our forebears, and we have a grasp of their immersion into this new land and the prospects of a new life, but it is this organization that has broadened our understanding of one of the most critical events in the timeline of not only the Cherokee, but inclusive of the Muskogee the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, the Seminole. You see, our tribes have a common kinship in removal, and thus we are inextricable heirs to the legacy of the durability as a people of a tribal culture. While not a scholar, I am an observer of times past, and more so, I'm an observer of times present. I'm here to connect the dots between two specific periods and see if you agree that past is prologue. The painful irony is that the rhetoric of the pre-removal era of the 1820s echoes across the years. Examining the past, well, I would refer to George W. Goss, a 2011 master's candidate at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, who provides a clear and conspicuous look at the protagonist in the drama of the Indian Removal Act of 1830. And by the way, if you've not read his thesis, I direct your attention to Scholar Works at UMass Boston. It is here that he deploys an extraction of the personalities that were the titans of opinion, pro and con, in the arena of Indian removal. In my service to the nation as chairman of the 99 Constitutional Convention, Jack Baker was a delegate. Where is my cousin Deborah Scott, who was a delegate at that convention? One will find within the 4,000 pages of transcripts the use of Robert's Rules of Order that provided a formula for respectful debate of opposing thought. On several occasions, I declared from the chair that the force of consensus was in question and that I would receive delegates to take up the issue 3 for and 3 against with a designated time limit who would be recognized. Those who rose to be recognized were those whose impassioned knowledge or their articulation of the debate issue was often beyond that of the general delegation. Master's candidate Gross did exactly that in his thesis by examining the background and speeches of 3 in favor of removal and 3 against removal. The backdrop of rhetoric oscillated between passion and vitriol, served as a scene setter. It served as a scene setter for the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Not just for the 5 tribes, but for other nations as well. Hundreds of thousands of Native Americans being displaced from their ancestral homes. This is a TOTA conference. You know the timeline. 1752, Georgia becomes a British royal colony. 1776, 1781, there was a war with those pesky rebel American colonists, aided by the French, against the British forces that included American loyalists and, yes, some Indian allies. 1787, the U.S. consolidated through a constitutional federation of states. 1802, a compact between the United States and Georgia arranged alignment and settlement of Georgia's boundaries in exchange for the promise of land within those boundaries to Georgia. 1825, the Treaty of Indian Springs. The Creeks lost all land in the southeast and were deported to what is known as the Indian Territory. 1827, Cherokee National Council adopts a written constitution, a Jalagi. It was a base government that says we will unite together as a people to position ourselves here in our ancestral home, making the Cherokee government, oddly enough, a government illegal while denying the Cherokee people access to Georgian courts. That's exactly what the state of Georgia refuted with. 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected president of the United States. Now, there were 3 in favor, and there were 3 in favor of removal. In the affirmation for removal, of course, Andrew Jackson. And today, if you go to Bull Hollow in Delaware County, and you ask speakers there, what is the Cherokee word for devil? And we know this down here in Adair County, it's Oskina. But if you go up to Bull Hollow and ask them, they go, oh, Jack Skeena. The sad part is that I don't know why. I doubt that they know that they've glued Andrew Jackson's name into it. Now, my friends from Chewy over here, we know exactly why. It's called Jack Skina. He was the devil incarnate. Those that were in favor of removal, not only Andrew Jackson, but of course Wilson Lumpkin, the U.S. representative from Georgia, and Governor Lewis Cass of the U.S. Northwest Territories, up in Michigan, and yet he was a cabinet member of Jackson's cabinet. 3 against, easy to pick out, Chief John Ross, Jeremiah Everts of the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, and Plague Sprague, U.S. Senator from Maine. See, these were the opening act for the Senate and House debates of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that advanced through both legislative chambers beginning in February of 1830 and culminating with President Jackson signing the Removal Act into law on May 28, 1830. That act passed the Senate by 9 votes and in the House by Heesky, only 5. The question was framed how to regard the American collision between the growing white communities of the United States and the Indian communities of North America that had survived the European-American invasion up to that point. And this became a national question. It wasn't just in Georgia. This was throughout the United States. It was a national question. What do we do? How do we coexist here? Both proponents and opponents of removal described a dystopian country facing pressing grave problems. Both had advanced to almost entirely different but related problems, describing causes and solutions. If the debate formula and scope of the national audience in 1830 sounds familiar, one need only pick up a daily newspaper today. Or maybe you could just flip channels between CNN and Fox. Yeah. The same national awareness and the diametric extremes of today are unmistakably so 1830. Today, here 200 years later, this dialogue, I believe, and would advance to you, they still exist. These issues raised in the debate over the Indian removal occupied the minds of many Americans. The disposition and exile of the Cherokees in particular was an ordeal and a wrenching spectacle for many. The collision between Native sovereignty and U.S. policy regarding Indian communities east of the Mississippi was felt and reverbed across the country. Goss writes in his thesis that the number of articles, essays, and pamphlets that were printed and reprinted is established by F.P. Crucha to have reached over 500,000 readers. It's in the 1820s, 500,000 readers. It must have been like the Instagram of their time. One of Jackson's closest associates, Martin Van Buren, he wrote, and I quote, "This struggle will all probability endure as long as the government itself, and will in time continue to occupy the mind and the feelings of our people." Van Buren was indeed a distance visioner. For here we are today in this place at this TOTA conference with this topic occupying our minds and our feelings. What were the elements of division between 3-4 and 3 against? Well, Lumpkin, as early as 1818, what would he have said? Georgia could never be extensively developed until this northwest portion of the state was established by industrious, enlightened, and freehold populations entitled to and meriting all the privileges of citizenship. He was not talking about Cherokees. As he ran for Congress, I quote, "I was rather impressed with the belief that it was my particular mission instrumentally to do something to relieve Georgia from the encumbrance of the Indian population." Lumpkin was an unbending advocate of U.S. expansion and domination, I should say, throughout the 1820s and 1830s. The process of removal, of course, was nearing the expulsion of the Cherokees. During the Van Buren administration, Lumpkin, by this time a U.S. senator, opposed moves to even make arrangements with Chief John Ross for the Cherokees at the cost of the removal, or to allow time for them to initiate their immigration. No, we need you to leave as quickly as possible. For Lumpkin, there was no legitimate basis for supporting the rights of Cherokee communities in the Southeast. To him, the existence of the Cherokee Nation within the state's boundaries of Georgia was intolerable, a problem whose solution was long overdue. Lumpkin referred to the Cherokee Nation as a burden on the state, holding back its development and forcing it into an inferior state within the United States. One quote, and then I will ask you to remember. He says the resources of Georgia could never be extensively developed by a well-devised system of internal improvements and commercial and social intercourse without other portions of the Union. This needs to be for the Georgia people. These people, these native peoples must be expelled. Lumpkin, writing in 1827, was being held back. He said Georgia was being held back by what he described as an encumbrance on the people of Georgia. He went on to say that mostly mixed breeds and white bloods advanced the arts of civilization, that had their own written and printed constitution and code of laws, and declared themselves to be free and independent state and people. He saw that as a mockery of the Georgian government. Lumpkin goes on, contending for the sovereign constitutional rights of the state against federal usurpation with integrity, altogether Roman, he added. I acted the part of immutability itself in unyielding opposition to the slightest compromise with John Ross as regards to the slightest modifications of the Treaty of New Echota. Lewis Cass, that territorial governor of Michigan, who started in 1831 as being Jackson's Secretary of War, his rhetoric was identical. John Ross actually reached out to him to say, the Creator intended the earth should be reclaimed from a state of nature and cultivation. Cass then said that the human race should spread over it. A tribe of wandering hunters have a very imperfect possession of this country over which they roam. That was Cass's opinion. Andrew Jackson, for this group, I don't even need to quote his words. So, for those that were 3 in favor of removal and 3 against, well, I'll simply reach for a letter that was written from John Ross to John C. Calhoun in 1822. Brother, we have repeatedly complained to your government of the injuries done to our nation by our white brethren of the frontier states, in direct violation of the good faith solemnly pledged by your government that appears to be the great relaxation in enforcing those obligations. You see, those were the words of a wandering hunter. Yeah, those were the words of a wandering hunter. Jackson went on in 1824 to John C. Calhoun by saying, by tracing the situation of our ancestors for 200 years back, we see nothing desirable but much to deplore. The happiness which the Indians once enjoyed was now poisoned by the bad fruits of the civilized tree which was planted around them. Tumultuous war arose, and mountains and plains were covered with carnage. John Ross saw what had been wrought by those who came forward. I could go on and quote from 3 in favor and 3 against without problem. But instead, I want to get in our way forward machines. As I say, stay with me. Come with me for just a moment. Come with me. John Ross, Jeremiah Everett, Plague Sprague, all of these people that brought cogent arguments to defend the Cherokee Nation, well, they would in fact be here today with the same voice. With all of this hindsight, with all of this understanding, with a robust catalog of settled Indian law, moreover, with a defined timeline of the evolution of tribal government into a modern era. So Jay, what's your point here today? What's your point? What echoes of the past are you saying reverberate here today? The McGirt case has resurrected the reality of Native sovereignty and has brought into focus a number of conflicting views on how Native nations and state governments coexist. The United States search for which principles will be our primary pole star has always been in contention. From slavery to World War II internment, as Americans, we are a conflicted democracy. Will Rogers, a great Cherokee of the 20th century, once said that all I know is what I read in the newspaper. And it's true about me as well. I take a sharp stick and go out every morning to turn it over in my driveway, just to make certain there's not a snake under it, or that maybe I'm in the obituary. What's fascinating about this particular era is that Oklahoma's governor, Kevin Stett, a lumpkin redux. Chief, I will need the tribal marshals to escort me back home today because this is where I will most likely get into trouble. So I used the phrase lumpkin redux. Remember, all I know is what I read in the newspaper. Governor Stett said in a meeting not long ago, there is a storm of injustice that needs to be faced head on. Let me be clear. Tribal governments disbanded and allotted out all the land in 1907 in its statehood. My granny would say, bless his heart. Mike McBride, an associate of mine, Mike McBride III, he's a shareholder at Crow Dunlevy Law Firm. He chairs the Indian law and the gaming practice in their Tulsa office. I know this law firm well. And this is McBride's quote from this newspaper right here. Remember, I'm just reading the papers, all I'm doing. I would tell you this is a Ross redux. McBride said 38 federally recognized Native American tribal governments currently call Oklahoma their home. None disbanded at statehood, and none have disbanded since. Tribal governments remain strong and for the most part thriving. McGirt is the most important sovereignty decision in the history of Oklahoma, and its implications continue to get sorted out. But the 5 major tribes, the Cherokees, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, the Seminoles, and the Muskogee, as well as several smaller tribes as the Peoria and the Quapaw in northeastern Oklahoma, they have had their reservations affirmed through the appellate courts after McGirt, and he concluded by saying, the earth has not shattered. Governor Stett, at the Chamber of Commerce meeting in Tulsa just a few months ago, I quote from the newspaper, a single mom of another race would pay taxes, but a doctor who is part Indian doesn't pay taxes or doesn't get speeding tickets in Tulsa from the police department. McBride, on the Ross side, this too is incorrect. First, tribal sovereignty is not about race. It is about government-to-government relationships. I am a citizen of the Cherokee Nation. Tribal citizens are a political classification, not a racial group. And that was affirmed by the United States Supreme Court last June during the Brackeen case. As to taxes, McBride goes on and continues to say the U.S. Constitution 14th Amendment provides that Native Americans are not taxed within their jurisdiction. And the Supreme Court ruling in McClanahan in 73 in the Sac and Fox Nation 2 decades later that tribal citizens who live and work within Indian country are not subject to state taxes. The Stovall case, currently pending in the Oklahoma Supreme Court, will address another. Certain Native taxpayers will be able to claim tax refunds from Oklahoma on income earned from reservation and taxpayers of their tribe. As for speeding tickets, McGirt and McBride, tribal citizens have to abide by the same rules of the road as all others do. There's not a separate speed limit for tribal citizens, contrary to the governor's recent suggestion in a social media meme. Now, all tribal citizens who break the law are still subject to penalties, and it is just a matter of where and how justice resources and fines are allocated. The tribal officials may be prosecuted or tribal offenders, I should say, could be prosecuted and pay fines under cooperative agreements between tribes. For example, our Cherokee Nation has over 25 agreements with Oklahoma municipalities to share fines and duties. Last month, Governor Stett, Lumpkin Redux. I'm trying to protect eastern Oklahoma from turning into a reservation. McBride, Ross Redux. Well, that ship has sailed. The sky has not fallen, and it's time for detente for the governor to work with the tribes and for the good of Oklahomans. Today, I believe there is a haunting specter for the nations that were removed under the tenets of the 1830 Indian Removal Act. I also believe that tribally we have made our last physical exodus. You see, we're here now. However, there may well be an amorphic trail of tears if polarization is left unchecked. This embroilment between states' leadership's misunderstanding of the realities of sovereignty and a segment of the populace willing to believe that there is injustice and a lack of fairness in the legal estuary of McGirt. This rhetoric could well lead to irreparable damage to what our tribal nations bring to the state's economy and social amity. The very things that we brought with us across the Trail of Tears and we've safeguarded and we've nurtured and now amplify through our enterprise and our governance are potentially jeopardized by the same prejudice and the plenary desire that existed in Georgia in the 1820s and culminated in Congress in 1830. So, what would I have you do during this conference? What would I have you do as an epilogue to my visit with you today? Yes, we will learn more, we will discuss more, we will deepen our historic understanding of the elements of perseverance honed during the removal, but I ask that you take with you an awareness that there are identical thought holders today, armed with the same thinking, political rhetoric, and the tactics used 200 years ago. History has the durability to germinate both good and evil. We should expand our dialogue. We should demand no less than thoughtful consensus from those who seek to overlord, and I believe that we can and should sculpt an outcome of coexistence between state and native nation. In so many ways, ladies and gentlemen, you see, it's required of us. It's required of us. While there's much between the dash, represented in the history between the dates of 1823 and 2023, when I observe the rhetoric of today, there's validation in Shakespeare's quote, "Indeed, the past is prologue." As descendants of those who endured the Trail of Tears and as recipients of the gift of their legacy, we are held accountable For we may well be the very reason they existed. We must amplify our historical perspective and not allow a modern removal. Sovereignty and self-determination are too valuable for future generations. However, this will require not only the strength of our tribal leaders, it will require the strength of our people. The same strength that was required of our ancestors who prevailed over the removal may well be required of us today. These things I believe. I suggest the time has come for us to get on to the getting on. I will indulge you for only another minute. I had not planned, but then I looked in my car and I saw a book, and I can't pass up a piece that I want to share with you in my closing. It's Outliers, The Story of Success by Malcolm Gladwell. Let me see the hands of those of you that have read this book. I see a goodly number. And if you've not, I'll make you this deal. You buy this book, you read it, you put your receipt in the front of it, what you paid for the book. If it's not of value to you, you mail it to me and I'll send you a check for the book. Now, you will have to send me the book. And I will not pay for the postage. But I will pay for you having read it. Malcolm Gladwell writes in Outliers, The Story of Success. And if he had only asked me, Jack, to edit his book, I could have helped him because I've marked it up here. He says, what is the question we always ask about the successful? We want to know what they're like, what kind of personalities they have, how intelligent that they are, or what kind of lifestyles that they have, or what special talents that they may have been born with. And we assume that it is those personal qualities that explain how that individual reached the top. In Outliers, he goes on to say, I want to convince you that these things of personal explanation of success don't work. They don't work. People don't rise from nothing. We do owe something to parentage and to patronage, and people who stand before kings may look like they did it all by themselves, but in fact they are invariably the beneficiaries of hidden advantages and extraordinary opportunities and cultural legacies that allowed them to learn and work hard and make sense of the world in ways that others cannot. It makes a difference where and when you grew up. The culture we belong to, the legacies passed down by our forebears, shaped the patterns of our achievement in ways we cannot begin to imagine. It's not enough to ask what successful people are like. In other words, it's only by asking, where are they from, that we reveal the logic behind who succeeds and who doesn't. For each one of you here today, if you are Cherokee, or if you are of the other tribes that ancestors that were removed to this place called Indian Territory, if you are a dedicated student to advance the dialogue of what this organization means, you see, you are the ones of success. We are the keepers of this legacy. And with that, in this conference, I'd simply say, Idana, you come with me.